Welcome everyone to this workshop on the Duke Research Data Repository, where we're going to share with you some of the resources that are available to you for sharing your data and also how we can help researchers steward your data into the future. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Sophia Lafferty-Hess. I'm a research data management consultant within the libraries, and I am here with my colleague, Maura Downey. I can let her introduce her position as well.
Hi, I'm Maura Downey. I am one of two digital repository services analysts and work with Sophia and Jen on curating research data.
And we do want to give a shout out to our other partners on the Duke Research Data Curation team, Jen Dara and Sade Gatlin, who are not here with us today, but they're a very important part of our overall team. So I'm going to give a little bit more of an introduction for the center which I work in, the Center for Data and Visualization Sciences, since we're here to talk all about data. CDVS has multiple programs that support data-driven research, including data science, GIS and mapping, data visualization, and data management. So you can reach us at sdata@duke.edu and set up a one-on-one consultation, send us your questions. If we're not the right group to help you, we're always happy to also help connect you with others on campus. Another piece to our services is that we do a lot of instruction and training throughout the semester. So you can go to our website that's on this slide and see upcoming workshops. We have a large amount of workshops on things like R, if you're interested in poster design, and we've got lots of data management ones as well that I'll share with you later. We can also do one-on-one or group trainings by request. But to move on to the thing that we're really here to talk about today, the Duke Research Data Repository. So what we like to call the RDR was launched in 2018, and that we do serve both the campus side and the medical side. And this is part of a robust initiative to really help Duke researchers more effectively and efficiently manage and share their data. So I'm going to actually let Maura talk a little bit about the infrastructure piece. We are built on open source software application, and she knows a little bit more about this kind of architecture than I do. So
a very little bit more. So yeah, just briefly, the RDR was built using Hyrax, which is a customizable Ruby on Rails engine that builds on the Samvera open source framework for repository front ends. It uses Fedora 4 currently as its persistence layer and Apache Solr as the basis for its discovery and access interface. So on top of that built-in persistence layer, as a matter of practice, the repository backs up our data and metadata with 3 additional copies, 1 on an OIT NAS volume on campus and 2 additional tape copies.
So how can the repository help you? Well, first we can help you share your data with the world. So all data in the repository is openly accessible for others to access. And we hope that this is a way that you can help increase your reach and impact through things like data citation. We've talked to researchers where just making their data available has brought up opportunities for new collaborations. And I've even worked with researchers before where they're writing their commitment to open science and data sharing into things like broader impact statements and grant applications. We can help you protect your work's future. So our goal is not just to make the data accessible today or tomorrow, but for 5, 10, 15 years from now, you can feel assured that your data is going to be safe. A big one is complying with journal and funder requirements. So we're increasingly seeing journals requiring things called like data availability statements, where you have to say where your data can be found for the purposes of verification and reproducibility. Likewise, we're increasingly seeing funder requirements around having things like a data management plan as part of a grant proposal package. And a new one that just came out, NIH just released a new data management and sharing policy that's going to go into effect in 2023. And I would say it's much more robust than their previous policy. And it's also more explicit about the importance of using things like established repositories for the purposes of data sharing. And then finally, to help make your data fair, and FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So there's a number of things that the repository can do to help make your data fair. So fair is kind of gaining a lot of attention as the ideal guiding principles for what shared scientific data should look like. And so some of the things that we can do to help make your data fair is that we do assign digital object identifiers, or DOIs, to all data sets. So that means you have that persistent URL that people can use to always get back to your data. We're also indexed in Google datasets for increased discovery. As I said, for access, all data are openly accessible for direct download. So anyone in the world can go to the repository and download that data. For interoperability, we do assign standardized Dublin core metadata. So essentially that's the description of the data package within the repository for things like discovery and search. And for reusability, I would say reusability is one of the hardest aspects of FAIR to really meet fully. And so to help our researchers make their data more reusable, we do a curatorial review of all data prior to publication. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in practice in a few minutes. And then finally, we do ask that all data sets receive a standard Creative Commons license so people know how they can or cannot use your data. So we always like to also share, I've kind of shared what we think some of the benefits are, but we always like to share what our users are saying as well. So this is Dr. Patrick Charbonneau, who is one of our top depositors from chemistry and physics, and he shared with us why he thought this was important. For one thing, that ensures that reproducibility of the underlying science and the long-term stability of the work. So Dr. Charbonneau is actually integrated data deposit in for every article he publishes in his lab, regardless if they have a policy or not. And he sees this as a way, when there is some natural turnover in his research group, to ensure that not only others can access the data, but that his research team itself knows where the data are at and that they're in a good form and well documented, things like that. I'll also call out his mention of responding promptly to external requests. I think this is a big one that can save researchers time. He had situations prior to building this into his workflow where people were contacting him and interested in his data and interested in building on his work, and he'd have to go and find the data and kind of package it and send it off. And now if he gets those requests, he can just point them to the repository, give them that DOI link, and it's really a big time saver for him. So what's in scope for the repository? What do we actually take? So first, we cannot take any data that contains sensitive or restricted information. So no confidential data, no PII, no PHI, anything that cannot be made public and openly accessible is not in scope for our repository. Also data that you have the rights to disseminate, so nothing that's encumbered by copyright or licenses or data use agreements. So this is something, if you're using secondary data, that you really need to think carefully about. Data in a final publication ready form. So this is not a place for data that's being actively used. It's really that final home for data that's ready to be published and shared. And then in 2021, data sets under 100 gigabytes are free. And I'm actually going to let Maura talk a little bit more about the pilot we're running regarding larger data sets in a few minutes. And I did want to mention as well, if you guys have questions, we're a pretty small group that come up during this presentation, please do put them in the chat, and we can either address them then or we'll save them to the end if we're going to cover it in the future. So when it comes to preparing data for sharing, these are some of the things you may want to consider. So first, what data and materials are you actually going to share? And this is often very context specific on what was your purpose for sharing. And this is something we can help researchers kind of think through within the context of your own research project. You want to organize your data for reuse. So that relates to things like your folders and your file names. Consider your formats. So we want, ideally, it's best to use formats that are more open or standardized or broadly used within your community. It's important to generate that accompanying documentation so people can understand your data. And we have some submission guidelines that we hope can help researchers walk through some of these preparation steps. One of the big things I always like to note is if you're planning to share your data or publish your data, starting to plan before you even start collecting data is going to really save you time and make that process more effective. when it comes to organization or documentation, all those pieces, but particularly if you're working with things like human subjects data, because you'll want to make sure that you have written data sharing into your IRB protocol and have proper language for consent and your consent forms. So if you haven't planned for that, and we've worked with research teams where they haven't, and they want to publish their data, and really they have to go back to the IRB and do an amendment because their IRB documentation doesn't allow for data sharing. So kind of building on that idea of sharing human subjects data within the repository, we like to live by kind of this quote that data should be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. So as I've mentioned, we are an open access repository, but not all data can be made openly accessible, both from a legal or an ethical standpoint. So our goal is to help you find the right home for your data, or help you think through, should you even be sharing that data? And sometimes there may be an option to use a protected data repository that has access restrictions in place, or to share other materials if you can't share the underlying data themselves. So we're here, even if the RDR is not a good fit, to help you think about how is the best way to share that data, both from an ethical and legal standpoint. So if your data are in scope, what does that kind of transfer and submission process look like? So from a high level, you'd have your data on your local laptop or in the cloud or wherever that you're already backing up. And then you would go to the RDR website and submit a request, fill out some metadata. And after that's completed, we create a box folder where you would go and upload your files. After everything looks good, we transfer the data to that OIT managed network storage, as Maura mentioned, and that's how people will discover and access the data through the website. And Maura already mentioned this, but we do have that preservation treatment on the back end to protect your data. So have 4 copies, and we're doing things like checking for integrity over time to make sure the data don't become corrupted. All right, so now I'm going to try to do a live demo, so bear with me. And this is going to be kind of an example from some data that I have myself that's underlying my master's paper. So I have some data that I've actually been meaning to share for a long time, and I still have not gotten around to it because I'm not bound by a journal policy to share my data. But in preparation for this, I went and had to find my data in my documentation, and I will admit that they were named data in codebook, which is also slightly problematic. And I'll also say, I'm a research data management consultant. It's a little embarrassing to admit that it took me some time to find my data. It took me some time to really understand my documentation. So this was a good example of how when you step away from your data and your projects, after 5 or 6 years, it's a little bit more difficult to remember what you did and why you did it. So just a minor plug for good data management practices and documentation. So if I have my data in hand and I'm ready to deposit it, I would go to the RDR website and click on Deposit Your Data. We do link out to our policies and guidelines if you need to look at those before starting the submission process. We then ask that question about, do you have restricted or sensitive information? Because again, we can't take that. If you said yes here, we would email you and have, again, a conversation about if there's other options for your data. I'm going to say no. I'm also going to say my data is very small, so I'm going to say less than 10 gigs. There are some new workflows that Maura is going to talk a little bit about that support larger scale data. So these between 10 gigs and greater than 100 gigs. We have a data deposit agreement. So this says what we expect from you all and what you can expect from us. And then this is where you're going to put in your general metadata for your data set. So this is kind of that standardized metadata I was talking about. So I'd want to put in my title for my data set, and then our convention is to add data from before the title of the data of a journal article, which is what I have here. Then you have to put your name. So pretty typical, everything with a red asterisk is what is required. I don't have additional contributors. I'm not going to put an affiliation in because it's not particularly relevant for my sharing. And we do require that people have a contact person listed because we want to make sure if people have questions about your data that they can always get back to you. And we encourage people to include an ORCID identifier. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with ORCID, but it's essentially, it's a persistent identifier for you yourself as a researcher to help with disambiguation from other researchers. And then you'd have a brief description of your data set. So I could say this data set examines journal policies on data sharing. I would say that this is a very brief description. We would always encourage you to put a little bit more detail in there. Even just including something like an abstract for a journal publication can really give people a little bit more context about the study, what you're looking at, and kind of lead them to understand if they're interested in reusing your data. Then you want to have some keywords are also required. We have geographic area, which this is more if it's significant to the actual analysis of the data, and mine is not, so I'm not going to enter that. I can put when I collected my data. I don't really have any languages that are associated with it. My format is Excel files. And then this is an important field if the data are underlying like a publication or a paper, so that people, when they're accessing the data, can find that paper. So I'll put a link to my master's paper that's in the UNC Carolina Digital Repository. I didn't get any funding and I didn't have a grant for this. So again, we try to keep this the metadata relatively high level because we do have to describe lots of heterogeneous data, but we also want to keep it relatively straightforward for our researchers, so we don't ask for a huge amount of fields during that initial submission. I'm going to say I don't have a DOI. This relates to, it's not best practice to share, to assign 2 DOIs to the same data set. So if you have data in another repository and also want to have a copy here at Duke, that's fine. We just need to know if there's a DOI because we won't assign another one, and instead we'll kind of also point to that other data set because it can become a little confusing for end users if data are in multiple locations. This is that Creative Commons information I mentioned. So we encourage people to use a CC0 license, which is essentially putting the data in the public domain. And some of this has to do with some of the complexities around copywriting data in the United States, which I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but it can be complex, and theoretically you're not supposed to, you can't copyright facts. So best practice is, if possible, to assign a CC0 license because it removes some of those barriers to sharing. But if you are not comfortable with that, it's always your option to use a different Creative Commons license. And again, we're always here to talk through that with folks. All right, so that is the main form. Essentially what happens now is what I've already told you all. You get an email to a box folder, and then we start that curation process. So speaking of curation, what does that look like in practice? So again, we get your files in. Data curation is essentially any of those activities that can help make sure data are fit for purpose and available for discovery and reuse. So this can vary across different institutions and across different repositories, what this looks like in practice. For us, some of the things that we'll commonly do, we do try to open the files if we have the software to just verify that what we think is supposed to be there is what we have received. We also, one of the big things we do is check documentation for completeness. So we want to make sure other people can look at your data, understand what it's all about. So are the content of the data themselves actually described, and is the context of the research clear? We'll look at that file formats again to see if we have suggestions for how to transform those for better long-term preservation. We do disclosure risk review. So what I mean by that is if we get human subjects data, we make sure there's no inadvertent inclusion of things like personally identifiable information or protected health information. Or if it's secondary data, is there a potential that this data shouldn't be redisseminated? So we just do that overall review to make sure everything that is being given to us can be ethically shared. And then depending upon the data set, we may have some other data or code enhancements suggestions. So I'll also say this takes a village. We are a member of the Data Curation Network within the repository. So this is a Sloan Foundation funded grant that brings together 10 different institutions to share curation staff to really expand our ability to curate data from a broad array of disciplines and data types. So essentially how this works, if I get in a data set that I'm not familiar with, I can choose to send it to the network where they would do that curatorial review and provide recommendations back to the researcher. And I'll also say, we always tell researchers if we're going to send it to the DCN, and you have the choice to always kind of have us do the local curation if you'd prefer instead of sending it to the network. So after that curation review, essentially what you'll get from us is an email with some recommendations. We don't make changes without talking to researchers to any of their data or documentation. So this is what I sent to myself I know it's kind of meta, but in an effort of when I put on my curator hat and looked at my own data, this is what I found. And I found some inadvertent disclosure. I noted that my file formats, an Excel file, I would recommend changing that to CSV. As we saw, my file names, data, and codebook are really not very descriptive, so you wanted something a little bit more robust than that. And then my documentation was pretty light. So these would be things as a researcher, I could then go and address those recommendations and make some changes to my data set to help make it be a bit more fair. So this is what a data set looks like once it's in the repository. So essentially you have that data set description, your citation in the middle. That's where you have that metadata that's both supplied by the depositor and some of it's provided by us as curators or the system. And at the bottom of the screen, that's where you'll have your group of files. I'll also call out again that citation for related publications. So this is something that sometimes folks have when they're submitting data, but if not, we do ask for you to let us know if possible when that article's been published so we can add in that citation and create that bi-directional link. Final thing when it comes to, well, how are people maybe using my data? We do have some general analytics that come out of the box. So we have page views, so you can get kind of a high level idea, well, are people engaging with my data? We can't tell you exactly who's downloading your data or who's using it, but we can give you that kind of aggregate information. And I will say, as we said, we're working with open source software, and so we acknowledge that this is a place where we would like to make some more enhancements to the analytics. And that's something the community is interested as well. And it's definitely on our roadmap for enhancements. All right, so now I'm gonna turn it over. I haven't seen any questions pop up in the chat. So now I'm gonna turn it over to Maura to talk about a few more of the features of the repository.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. All right, can you see my slides? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so a couple of the things that one of the things that we've written into the repository locally is this ability to version data sets. So while we encourage depositors to really only submit their data when it's in a final publication ready state, we also kind of recognize that sometimes there are going to be errors that'll be discovered, or maybe a file will be left out during the submission process. So to meet the needs of depositors while also maintaining the integrity of a data set that's already been made available to the public and might have already been used or cited, we've developed a process for versioning deposited data. So each version of the data set will be given a new DOI. There's a versions tab on the dataset show page down at the bottom that will display the number of the version that the user is currently viewing, its DOI, a few narrative details about what has changed between the versions, and then the publication date. Search within the application is going to default to the most recent version of the data set, but older versions of the data will still be accessible. If someone happens to resolve the DOI of an older version, they'll still be able to view it, but you'll see this big red banner across the top stating that this is not the most recent version, and then a link to the most recent version. We also encourage depositors not to embargo their data, but we recognize that occasionally a publisher may require that they do so. So to accommodate this need, we've also developed a policy that allows depositors to request an embargo for up to 1 year after their deposit. So in this case, we'll make the dataset metadata available, but we'll suppress the files. And then we add this note to the dataset description stating that the data are embargoed until the publication of a related article or up to no more than 1 year from the data upload. We also have this dataset collection feature, which allows researchers to group datasets by project or by lab. With the most recent release of our software, we've refined this feature by enhancing the metadata that's available for use in describing collections. Researchers can link to specific creators. They can provide some contact information and subject keywords. And they can identify any grant funding agencies or specific grant numbers. Hopefully this will help to increase the transparency around how the research was underwritten. Once the data are published, the curation team also is going to add a citation to the depositors scholars at Duke profile. This is currently a pretty manual process that we do, but in the future, we really hope to better integrate the research data repository with Elements, which is the software that powers scholars at Duke, as well as with our open access publication repository, DukeSpace, and really highlight those connections between data sets and their related publications. So a brand spanking new, like super new, we just rolled it out last week, feature of the RDR is this integration with Globus, which is a file transfer service that's maintained by the University of Chicago. Globus is designed to provide high performance data transfers between systems within and across organizations. It's meant to be interruptible. So if a problem occurs during the data transfer, say, for example, something I think almost everyone has experienced at least once during this remote working situation, your internet connection is interrupted, or you run out of disk space on your local machine, something like that. The transfer can be pretty seamlessly resumed once the issue has been addressed. This is probably not news to this audience, but just to highlight, scientific research is increasingly happening at scale, and researchers are producing ever larger volumes of data. So it's now relatively routine for scientific instruments to produce terabytes and even petabytes of data in the course of normal observational behavior. We weren't really encountering anything quite at that size, but we increasingly were having researchers come to us with tens of gigabytes. And the workflow that Sophia described using Duke Box was pretty rapidly becoming inadequate. Prior to the pandemic, we just sort of used workarounds like we'd walk over to a researcher's office and borrow a hard drive. But for obvious reasons, that's not really an option anymore. And then on the other side of the data transaction, we sort of recognized that downloading tens of gigabytes through a web interface using HTTP requests is not an ideal scenario. So Globus seemed like it might be a good solution to these problems for a couple of reasons. One, Duke's the Office of Information Technology here on campus was already licensing Globus for use. And then one of our peer institutions, the University of Michigan, who also runs a data repository based on the Sambera Hyrax software, had already done a lot of the work to integrate Globus with Hyrax, so we thought we could hit the ground running. So I'm going to give a quick first overview of how the data transfer using RDR and Globus works, and then we'll take a closer look at downloading, and I'll give you a brief demo. So this diagram is pretty similar to the workflow process that Sophia explained earlier, but instead of using Box, we're going to use Globus. So say a researcher has data they'd like to make publicly available. They come to the research data repository and fill out the submission form. If their data are larger than 10 gigabytes, the curation team will send them an invite to share the data using Globus, which the researcher will then do using a local client or from another networked location. Once the data have been uploaded to Globus, the curation team pulls it down to OIT managed network storage, where we'll perform all of those curation activities Sophia described. We'll finalize the metadata, we package up the data, and then we ingest it into the repository. Once it's in the repository, then the data receive all that good preservation treatment we've talked about, so redundant copies and fixity monitoring. And then other researchers can discover the data by resolving a DOI or by searching the website. And then they'll click on a link to the data in Globus. And from there, they can transfer the data to the location of their choice. And then, like I said, I'll demo this in just a second. But before we get to Globus, I wanted to make a quick side note about downloading data from the repository generally. So there are two ways to download data from the RDR. For data sets like this one, which are under 2 gigabytes in size, you'll see a button to export directly and a button to get the data set from Globus. Direct export from the RDR now allows you to choose a tar or a zip archive of the data set. And then once a site session, you'll be asked to either log in via Shibboleth or complete a brief CAPTCHA form, but otherwise this should be a pretty seamless process. If you use data from the RDR frequently, or if you use Globus often for other work, you may actually find that using Globus is the easiest way to acquire even these smaller data sets. For data sets that are larger than 2 gigabytes, you'll see that the only option is to obtain the data using Globus. So let's take a quick pause with the slides and walk through how to get data using from the repository using Globus. So let me start out by pointing out that everything I'm about to show you is documented through the RDR help page, which is linked from various places on the throughout the site. This is going to include some links to the official Globus documentation. And then we also have a few nice screen capture recordings that will walk you through setting up a Globus endpoint and transferring files. I'll also note that for the purposes of this demonstration, I've already gone ahead and done one of the more important preliminary steps to transfer data, which is to download Globus Connect Personal, which is local client, and establish my own endpoint. In order to access, share, transfer, or manage data using Globus, the very first step is going to be to create this endpoint on a system where the data is or will be stored. An endpoint can be a laptop, a personal desktop, a laboratory server, a campus data storage service, a cloud service, or an HPC cluster. In this case, it's going to be my personal laptop, so I'm going to just set it up using Globus Connect Personal. So if I click on this Get Data from Globus, it'll take me to this Globus web app login screen. Here I can either authenticate using Shibboleth through Duke, so I would just select Duke from the dropdown and continue, or I can sign in using a Google ID or an Orchid ID. In this case, I'm going to sign in with Google because I have administrator privileges through Shibboleth, and that's not great for demonstrations. Okay, so once you've been authenticated, you'll be taken to this file manager screen. Depending on whether or not you've logged into Globus before, you may see this single panel view, or you may already be with this multi-panel view. It basically looks like if you've ever used an FTP client, it's very similar to that. Either way, you can switch back and forth between views using these buttons up here in the panels section of the upper right-hand corner. So a couple of things to point out quickly. In the panel where the collection name is Duke Research Data Repository Export, you'll see an alphanumeric string that corresponds to an RDR system identifier in the path. And then in the directory view, you'll see the files or folders that are associated with the data set. So in this case, she has a folder for drone imagery and a separate subdirectory for a couple of TIFFs. You'll see the README that the depositor has provided for the data set that describes the data methodology and all of that. And then you'll see these two system generated files that are prepended with the Duke RDR export. One of those is a system generated README file that includes all of the data set's metadata and a copy of the acceptable use policy for data that's been downloaded from the RDR. And the other file is a SHA-1 checksum manifest that, should you choose to do so, will enable you to ensure the bit level integrity of the files once they reach their destination. To specify a place to transfer the data, you're going to click on the search bar just above that second panel. I'm going to want to, from here, you're going to choose an endpoint. The terminologies can be a little bit confusing because they switch back and forth between endpoints and collections. But again, an endpoint can be a lot of things, but for the purposes of this demo, I'm transferring to my local laptop. So I'm going to want to make sure that Globus Connect Personal is running in the background, and I can tell that it is because I can see the little Globus icon in my system tray. So then I'll select the endpoint that I established when I was installing Globus Personal Connect, and you can see that it'll bring up my laptop directory here. So I've set up a directory on my desktop for Globus transfers, and I'll just navigate there. Alternatively, I could have, oh, and I meant to delete those before I started the transfer, but alternatively, I could have set up my endpoint to mount directly to this subdirectory, or I could bookmark this directory so that I don't have to navigate to it every time. So in the source panel, I'll just go ahead and click select all and then start the transfer. You'll see this green modal pop up that indicates that your transfer request has been submitted successfully. And then in addition, you'll see a little green icon pop up on the activity section of the sidebar. If you click on that, you can check the status of your download. You can see your history of downloads or data transfers. If there's an error that occurs with your transfer, you'll get a notification through this window, and you'll also get an email as well. And then if you go back to the file manager and click refresh on the destination pane, you'll start to see the files and folders appear as they're being transferred. So let's go back to the slides. So the process to submit data to us using Globus for curation and publication is going to look much the same. So when completing the submission form, you'll see that question that Sophia mentioned earlier with the 3 options regarding the size of your data. If your data are less than 10 gigs, you're taken through that box-based workflow. If your data are larger than 10 gigs, the workflow is modified as I've outlined to use Globus as the data transfer mechanism. So after a depositor completes the submission form, they'll receive an email asking to be sure that they have set up their endpoint. This will be followed by an invitation with a direct link to a specific collection on Globus that they can use to transfer their files to us. If your data are between 10 and 100 gigabytes, congratulations. You probably qualify for this pilot that we're running this year to support large-scale data that will provide 100 gigabytes of free preservation storage per deposit. Quick caveat for that, the Office of Research is encouraging researchers who are writing new grants to include budgeting for storage in their direct costs whenever possible. And we do have a cost model that can be used based on differing preservation periods. This is not uncommon, and so many funders will expect to see this in your budget. The pilot is really meant to help researchers who either don't have funding at all or completed their grant work a while ago and they now need to publish their data. For researchers who need to publish data that are larger than 100 gigs, we've integrated this cost calculator into the data submission form, which will ask depositors to enter the approximate size of their data in gigabytes, select a billing period, and then provide a fund code to which we can charge the estimated costs. As we note here in the cost calculator, we will contact you before processing payment if the full cost of storage is going to vary significantly from what we've estimated via this calculator. And just to plug, if you're currently at the grant writing stage and you're interested in incorporating the RDR into your funding application, we can provide boilerplate language about the repository for data management plans. Just feel free to contact us directly if you need this service. We don't have it publicly posted anywhere because we want to ensure that we know when we've been written into a grant application so that it doesn't come as a surprise. The final thing that I'll highlight about the repository with our most recent software release is that we are also now accepting de-identified data from PACE, the Protected Analytics Computing Environment offered by Duke's Office of Academic Solutions and Information Systems. So depositors will now be offered an opportunity to provide a link to data that's been vetted through an honest broker and deemed fully de-identified. We're currently collaborating with PACE staff to create some documentation around this workflow and generate language for PACE users or other Duke Health System researchers who want to use the RDR as their repository. This language will help cover data sharing in consent language, as well as repository information for the IRB. So to bring it on home, as part of some recent marketing and outreach efforts, we interviewed one of our repeat depositors to ask him what he liked about using the RDR. It is, of course, always great to hear it couldn't possibly have been easier, but that's what we really hope to do with these services and this program, is to make things like research transparency, compliance, and open science generally just much easier for folks so that they can focus on what's really important, their research. And then just to reiterate a couple of quick plugs for some of the other ways that our program can help you. The RDR is not going to be the best solution for all data, as Sophia mentioned. We can't take, sensitive or restricted data, but we can help identify appropriate repositories when the RDR isn't going to be a great fit, and we can help you facilitate your deposit with those repositories. The data curation services that we provide come at no cost, whether you are depositing data in the RDR or in another repository. And just as a reminder, these services include a review of your file structure, your file formats, and the content in order to provide recommendations for optimizing data for formal publishing. We can review consent forms to ensure that they have the language necessary to facilitate data publishing. Any human subjects data that we are going to take with the RDR, we will require that they include a copy of the consent form or at least a waiver of consent. And then lastly, as Sophia mentioned, we provide individual or small group consultations on data management and data sharing practices, and we can offer specialized workshops on request. And I'm going to let Sophia take this last slide.
Sure. So I already mentioned that CDVS, my department, has a variety of workshops that we offer throughout the school semester. So this is just a list of the upcoming workshops. A couple actually have already taken place, but to give you an idea of some of the things that we are making available for trainings to the Duke community. I also like to quickly just plug 3 of the data management workshops that I have highlighted there, because we've talked about and touched upon briefly some of these topical areas. So for the ethics of data management, in that workshop, we'll be going into a lot more depth on things like data de-identification, proper data sharing language for consent forms, and also talking a little bit about how we work with communities and really think about DEI principles in relation to data management. Also meeting DMP requirements. I mentioned the NIH new policy that came out. We're going to be doing a bit more of a deep dive on that and helping people think about, how do we write a good data management plan that can then be implemented. And finally, the preparing data for publishing. I did a really, really brief high level covering of kind of what is curation, how do you think about preparing your data, and we're going to go into a lot more depth in that workshop on that, as well as thinking about how we select a repository if the RDR is not a good fit for your research. So I think that is all that we have today. If you have questions, we have 15 minutes. We wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. So please do, either you can put them in the chat or just speak up since we got a small group today.